This is the second interpretive video of the I.33 Clerus Lutegerus manuscript interpretation, and we'll be talking about pages 3 and 4 and what's going on there. And on pages 3 and 4 is the majority of the information about how the system works in a lot of ways. This is the page that really tells us a lot of stuff. The first thing is that it shows underarm, the first ward, versus half-shield, which is one of the sieges or oppositions to many of the wards. But it's particularly this pair of ward and siege that are used most often throughout the manuscript as a pair. So first of all, we need to look at underarm as a position. Underarm is a right foot forward position with the sword tucked up under the arm and the buckler held in front of the hands. And I like to tuck my elbows in tightly here so that I'm kind of huddled together. And I don't remember where this came from, but I often call this the squirrel eating the nut pose because I'm hunched down like a little squirrel eating my nut. So this is the position that we use for underarm. Now one thing, you'll notice that when I stand here, I have my sword blade horizontal and John holds his vertically. It doesn't really matter. This is my preference, that's his, do what you want with that. So underarm, it says on page 3, has two oppositions, which are long point and half shield. Then at the bottom, it says that sometimes underarm is also opposed by underarm. So half shield is the one we'll be dealing with the most. I'll come back to that in a moment. Long point is only briefly mentioned on this page, but long point is essentially any position where your sword is pointed forward. It might be high, it might be low, but that both your hands are out. And it most often tends to be a left foot forward position in this system, but not always. It can be either foot forward. But most of the best attacks come into a left foot forward position. Now, the second choice, if underarm is opposed by underarm, there is a very long, complicated thing that basically says you need to adopt a position similar to half shield. So if I oppose John with underarm, we've moved into our siege distance here. Neither of us is taking control of the center at this point in time. And really, this isn't a good choice for the person doing the siege to come into this position because they're not doing anything to control the center of the action. So somebody needs to do that. So the response is to move into a position like half shield, which involves just bringing the arms out like this, and the shield is kept on the right-hand side of the sword. The sword is brought up to a 45-degree angle. And this is very similar to half shield. So the most common siege, though, is half shield itself. We usually start from a further distance to move into half shield, and I like to start from the second ward because it's just a nice position to start from. So I'm starting with my buckler extended in the right shoulder, second ward. And from here, I step forward into half shield like so. You can see my sword is at about a 45-degree angle. It's not an attack, I'm just moving in towards John. My buckler is out beside my sword hand, covering it, and from here, my hands are safe. Even if John tries to attack my hands on the right-hand side, my buckler actually is interposed between there, if he can reach my hand at all, which ideally, hopefully, he can't. But even so, my buckler is here to offer protection. This is not an attack, it's just taking control of the space. Now showing half shield, moving into half shield straight on, I'm in the second ward now, and I'm stepping into half shield. The sword is coming in more or less right up the middle. And I think that this might be the reason why it's called half shield, is because it's dividing my body into half and protecting me from that middle with the split into half. And it's just a geometrical thing, kind of like when your buckler is out, it covers a wider area than the size of a buckler. Here, my sword is out. For John to attack me, the angle that our swords create makes his sword be actually pointing past me rather than straight to the middle. I'm not 100% sure that that's a reason, but it makes sense to me. Now, going back to underarm versus half shield, as I step in to half shield, it notes that the person in underarm cannot reach my upper targets. And this is because my sword is in the way. He really can't hit me up here, so he can't attack there. It also mentions that it's not safe for him to attack my lower targets because he endangers his head. This basically just means that if he's attacking me low, I have a geometrical advantage to strike to his head. And We see this in all kinds of other sword systems. This is really common. So it says that he should do no attack. Instead, he should fall under the sword and shield. There's a lot of debate about what this means. For us, falling under the sword and shield is an action of punching both hands forward and towards the left shoulder. So when I come into Halfshield, John's going to punch both of his arms together, and his buckler arm unfolds just in front of his sword as it's coming out, and he's just crossing my sword, foible to forte, to create a bind. He's not looking to overpower me. He doesn't have enough strength with his foible on my forte to do that. He's just trying to create a point of contact, and it's also an invitation at this point. But they do specify that you should not be doing an attack. You should instead fall under the sword and shield. So, not an attack. Now, at this point, actually one more thing about this. In the manuscript, the first illustration shows underarm versus Halfshield. The second one shows the picture of having fallen under the sword and shield. The way we time this action is a little bit different from that. If I start back here in second ward, as I step in and John sees that I'm going into Halfshield, he's going to fall under the sword and shield so that his sword lands against mine at the same time that my foot lands. Like so. He wants to be at that point of contact as soon as I get here, so that we are at the bind. Continuing with this interpretation of page 3, we are told that if the person entering this siege is not held in check by falling under the sword and shield, they immediately may enter and attack. And this is just briefly mentioned here, but followed up later. But for the sake of completeness, I enter into Halfshield. I enter into Halfshield, and John fails to keep me in check by falling under the sword and shield. He simply stays where he is. At this point, I can either step in and attack him, and he can't really do a lot about it, or even better yet, I can pin his shield down and attack him here. That will come up again. It then says that John should fall under the sword and shield as I step into Halfshield, and that if his opponent is ordinary, he will attack the head without a counterbind or anything like that. So I extend to attack John's head, and it says that John's response to this should be a thrust. So as I thrust for John's head, he steps offline and stabs me in the face instead. And his buckler keeps him safe here. That also will come up again later. It says then that I should instead counterbind and step. So I step into Halfshield, John falls under the sword and shield, I counterbind and step in with my shield knock or shield strike, and then I can do whatever I want from here. Now interestingly, the text seems to say that if I do this, John's counter should be a shield strike. And they only say this here and never say it again in the manuscript, and they don't illustrate him doing a shield strike as a counter. And I think it's either a text error or possibly a translation error, although both translations I had say the same thing. And the problem with this is that once I step into Halfshield, John falling under the sword and shield, if I counterbind and step in with a straight arm, John cannot overpower me by shield striking back once my body gets my weight past, my center of balance past my rear foot. Even a very small person shield knocking against a very large person, the large person cannot push them back. So this seems to be a bad idea. Other than an error, the other possibility is they're talking about combining the shield strike with another action, and the other actions are described on page 4.